I'm Evan, Head of Engineering for RMSTATOR. Today we're going to be showing you how to install our new flywheel stator, regulator, and gasket on a, this is a 2007 Yamaha YZF-R1 1000cc sport bike. So these were a really cool motorcycle, a really popular sport bike, and the 04 to 08 models had a really unique flywheel because it was gear driven up here above the motor, and it rode on bearings. It was a really unique setup and only used on those years. For the R1. It was also used on the FZ1 and the FZ8 model Yamaha. So there's quite a few bikes that use this system, but it's just unique compared to the other Yamaha YZF sport bikes that used a typical stator and permanent magnet flywheel setup that was down here driven off of the crankshaft. The main problem with these flywheels is that the magnets came loose on a lot of the original Yamaha flywheels, and they can destroy the stator. You can get pieces of metal down in your crankcase and cause all sorts of issues. So it's a really nice upgrade. Our flywheel is capped inside. The magnets are secured and capped with a stainless steel sleeve, so they're protected. And we have a really nice high quality OEM style stator and voltage regulator available, so you can replace the whole charging system. So I'm going to show you the parts real quick. Here's our new flywheel for the R1, and then we have our stator. And you can see they're kind of a, if you're used to other sport bike stators and flywheels, this is all kind of a unique shape on the R1. It's a really unique system. And then we have our voltage regulator and our stator cover gasket. So we have everything you need to replace the charging system on your R1, and we're going to go ahead and get started showing you how to install all this. To begin with, we're going to do two things first, and then we'll show you the next shot. You're going to go ahead and need to get your gas tank lifted up because your voltage regulator and stator connection is mounted inside the airbox under here. And you're also going to need to remove the left side fairing so we have access to the flywheel and stator cover. So I'm going to get this bodywork removed and out of the way, and then we'll start showing you how to replace these parts. Okay, so we're starting at the top of the airbox where the regulator is mounted. Now, to get to this, you have to remove a few things. You need to remove your seat, which is uses two 5mm Allen bolts, and that's to give you access to the be able to lift the gas tank up. You have two plastic panels on either side of the gas tank that have to be removed with a Phillips screw and slid out of the way. And then the front gas tank mount up here is a Allen bolt 5mm as well. And once all that's removed, you can lift the gas tank up and prop it up with something. I use a rubber mallet here to keep it up in the air. Then you'll see your airbox cover sitting on top. I've already removed it. It comes off with Phillips screws all the way around. There's 10 of them maybe. And once all those are loose, you can lift the cover out of the way, and then you can lift your air filter out of the way, which was sitting right here. Okay, so that's everything I did to get to this point. So now the next thing you need to do is get the rest of the airbox tray loose so you can get it out of the way. There is 6 bolts here that hold the velocity stacks, I guess you call them, to the airbox assembly. We have some socket extensions here showing the location. There's 3 kind of in a triangle pattern on each pair of the stacks, and I believe they're 4mm Allen heads, so you can use an extension and get them all loose. Once they're all loose, you'll notice the airbox assembly will be loose, but there's still a couple more things you need to do. At the back of the airbox here, there's a vent hose. That's a rubber tube with a clamp on it. You just need to unplug that. On this side of the airbox, the right side, you'll see there's another hose here that needs to be loosened. So I have that done out of the way. And then down here, and I'll show you better once it's removed, is the plug for the velocity stacks, I guess, have a servo that moves them. So you need to unplug that as well. Okay, once that's all out of the way, I can lift the airbox assembly up and out. All right, now we have a lot more room and we can see better what's going on. Here's the 2 hoses. Here's the rear one. Here's the side one. And down here, I might not be able to see from that angle, but is the other side of the connector, white plug. Okay, with all that out of the way, the next thing we need to do is remove the front of the panel here that separates the regulator from the airbox housing area. There's a clamp here And I wanted to show you how it works because it's a little confusing. It'll have a Phillips screw in the center, and it'll have two 4mm Allen head bolts on either side. And it's mounted right here in front, and it screws to the frame to keep this kind of blocking plate that separates the regulator in place. With all three of those removed, you can take that piece out and set it out of the way. And now I'll have the separator here. You can just tilt backwards and it'll pull away. And it does have a connector tied to it, so I'm not going to remove it. I'm just going to set it out of the way. All right, so with all that done, now you can see the regulator. The voltage regulator is mounted to the frame up here in front of the whole airbox area, and it'll remove, I have a different regulator mounted here with some Phillips screws. The original regulator will use some 10mm bolts to mount it in this location. And the connectors just have clips. You can press and remove. And that is how the voltage regulator comes out. It's really simple. Okay, when you're installing your new voltage regulator, obviously it'll go right back here in the same location. Your connectors will plug in. They're keyed and locking connectors, so you really can't plug them in wrong. And they'll plug right back in here. The assembly of all this, I'm not going to show it. It's the reverse of everything I just showed you. Just take your time, make sure you get all your bolts lined up, and it's pretty easy to put back together. I will show you right here when you're changing your stator. Move this out of the way. Here's how the stator wiring is routed, just along the edge of the frame here. It's tucked along the side of the throttle bodies and all the way up to the front. So when you're changing your stator as well, just make sure you route the wires safely, and make sure you have it loose here so you can pull the stator wires out with the stator when you remove it from the side of the bike. Okay, so I'm going to leave all this loose because we're going to be changing the stator as well. So we're going to switch to the side of the bike to show you how to do that next. All right, now we're going to remove the stator and flywheel that's on the left side of the bike here. Like I said earlier, you need to have your whole left side fairing removed and out of the way. I'm not going to show every single fastener, but you've got a couple of the twist lock fasteners up at the top, a few down at the bottom. You have some Allen bolts here that attach the rear of the fairing and the bottom of the fairing. And then you have a couple of the little plastic push pin type fasteners up at the front. So once you remove all those, and just be gentle, don't pull on the plastics too much so you don't break any of the fasteners, but take your time, follow where each one is held up, and you'll be able to remove them all and remove the side of the fairing easily. And this does, the very lower doesn't have to be completely removed. It can just be loose and hanging down. It gives you plenty of access to the flywheel stator cover. So first, I'm going to pull the stator wiring harness out so it's loose, so it can come out with the cover. So I've got that out of the way. I loosened all the bolts around here. You have some 6mm and 5mm Allen heads that fasten the flywheel cover or stator cover in place. So I have them all loose. Bolts are the same length of the two different sizes, so you don't really need to keep them separate here. And it's very obvious which size is which, so you can't really put them back wrong. Get those all out of the way. I've already loosened the cover up, but you can use, there's a little pry tab here on the side. You can use a flathead screwdriver to gently pry to pull the cover off. And you might need to move these wires. Sometimes you have to disconnect them, or you might just push them out of the way to make sure you have plenty of clearance. Okay, then you can pull your cover off. And there's not much to it, just gently pull out. You might have to wiggle it around just a little bit. And slide the whole assembly out. Usually the flywheel will come out stuck to the stator like this, so it'll all come out together. A couple things I want to show you to make sure you watch for, because I had this happen here. If you look here, you'll see there's a washer sitting on top of the inner part of the flywheel. Make sure you don't lose that and it falls down into the crankcase. It really generally sticks to the flywheel, so it's not a problem, but make sure it's still there. Set that down. Then there's also another washer on the inside, or a spacer, I guess you'd call it. And this one did fall off as I pulled the flywheel out. Almost always it'll fall down off the bearing and just sit on this little shelf here. But you want to make sure you have both of those parts. Do not continue until you're sure you have both of them and they're both with your flywheel, because there is an opening for the gear drive here down into the crankcase, and you want to be really careful those parts don't fall in there. Now, I've changed this flywheel 10 times on this bike in testing, and I've never once dropped them into the crankcase, so I don't want to scare you, but just make sure you look for it. And you'll see your gasket here. We're going to be replacing it, so I'm going to go ahead and remove it. And like anytime you're changing a stator, make sure your gasket surface is clean on both sides before you reassemble. Okay, so now that I've got this out, we're going to go to the bench and change the stator. So we'll show you how to do that, and then we'll show you how to put your new flywheel in. Okay, so we're going to change the stator in the side cover here. I have already removed the flywheel, as you can see, and just to let you know, when you're usually like I showed earlier, the flywheel comes out with the stator cover, and the magnets are strong. It's kind of a tight fit, so a lot of times what I'll do to remove it is put a piece of paper towel or cardboard or something on the edge of the stator cover here, and then I can kind of pry gently against it on each side to get the flywheel lifted up. As soon as you get it lifted up a little bit, the whole thing will slide off. So I've already done that, and I just wanted to show you in case it's covered in oil, so it's hard to lift up. So that'll help you get it loose, and then you can pull it out. Okay, so here's our stator in the side cover. They're Torx T27 bolts that hold the stator down to the cover, and an 8mm bolt for the wire clamp. I've already loosened all that. Set that out of the way. Remove bolts. Stator just lifts up. And when you look at the bottom, you'll notice that there's some holes here. Let's see, these two guys, the two small holes. So here's our 3 mounting bolt holes, here's our clamp, and then 2 small holes. And let me set this out of the way. Now if you look at the side cover, you'll see why. There's room for the wire clamp here, and then there's 2 studs here that locate in the holes to make sure the stator is lined up perfectly. So just so you know what you're looking at when you put it back together, I'm going to take the new stator. I can see where the wire clamp is, so I know generally how to locate it. And then if I move it around a little bit, I'll feel it drop and lock into place on the studs down there. So once I do that, I know the stator's perfectly lined up. I'm going to make sure the wires route in this little cavity right here, and grommets in place. So really easy to get it all lined back up. And then you put your bolts back in. Make sure you use red Loctite on all these, and just make sure you cover the threads a little bit. And we'll do that on all of them. Same thing on the wire clamp. You'll see it has a little locating stud as well. And then you bolt it all back together and torque it down. Really simple to put that back together after changing the stator. Okay, so I will tighten that up later myself. I'm going to get that out of the way, and I'm going to show you a few things about the flywheel. So when you're installing your new flywheel, which I have here, you need to swap over the parts here, the gears and the cush drive assembly inside. I'll show you as I take it apart. A few things I want to point out. I mentioned earlier this collar and the washer that will come off. So you want to make sure you have those. I talked about that. Here's the washer. The main thing I want to point out is this collar here that sits on the outside. If you look closely at it, hopefully the focus will be okay, you'll notice that one side of it is totally flat and like a 90-degree inside. If I flip it around, you'll see the other side is beveled. It's cut down at an angle inside. Okay, when you put this back together, I'll mention again when I reassemble it, the beveled side here goes inside towards the gears. So when I reassemble it, it's like this. Washer, beveled side of the spacer, go just like that. Okay, I just wanted to point that out first so I don't forget. And I'm going to go ahead and swap the parts, and then we'll show you reassembly. Okay, so to remove the parts that we need to reuse, you just hold the base of the flywheel and just kind of wiggle it back and forth a little bit, and you'll see the whole thing will come off. So here's our old flywheel. You can see the teeth here we'll talk about in a second that the cush drive goes on, the rubber bits. Okay, so I can get that out of the way. Don't need that anymore. All right, so now we can look at the parts that we need to reuse. I'll just pull one out of the way. You'll see that it has these rubber cushion spacer kind of things that help grab onto these teeth back here, and it cushions it all up for the starter, because the starter is part of this whole gear assembly. So they usually stay in place. If they fall out, it's no big deal. All three of them are the same. They all drop down into a cavity, and the open side here goes out because it's going to fit into teeth on the flywheel. Okay, and the only other thing, all this is attached in one piece. It has your one-way drive for the starter. And it can come out, I guess, if you pull on it, but there's not much to it. You can just slide it back into place. Okay, the other part you need to look at that sometimes falls out when you're doing this is this collar that goes inside. So there's nothing to it. It's the same either direction. It just fits down inside the brass bushing in there. All right, so now I have my whole assembly. Need to swap it onto my new flywheel. Here's my new flywheel. If I look at this, I'll see I have 3 even spaces here on the rubber. I'm going to line them up, and sometimes you have to slide that collar around a little bit, and then I'm going to look and line up the teeth with the rubber, pull it all together. So there we go, you can see it's all meshed now, it's all seated down onto itself. And then put my washer back in place, and then the spacer with the beveled edge going in. There we go. Okay, just like that. That's how you reassemble your flywheel. So now that I have this back together on our new flywheel, and I'm gonna get the stator tightened up in the cover, and then we're gonna go to the bike and get this reinstalled. Okay, so now we're gonna get the flywheel and the stator back on the bike. First thing we have to do is put the flywheel back in place, and this is a little tricky, so I'm gonna start doing this and we'll splice in later when I actually get it lined up. It's not difficult, it just takes time. You just have to play around with it a little bit till you get it lined up perfectly. The reason is the back of the flywheel that you've already seen from swapping these parts is you have 2 sets of gears, and the teeth have to mesh on 2 totally separate gears to get this all lined up perfectly. You have your starter clutch on the back, and then your crankshaft engagement gear here. So and then also, like I mentioned earlier, you have that collar and the washer that can fall off. So you just kind of have to take your time, get everything lined up, and you're gonna have to try a couple times till you get everything lined up perfectly. When you do, you'll know it'll slide into place just fine. So I'm gonna go ahead and line it up here and try and get it straight until I feel it engage in the bearing in the back, which I did. And then from this point, it's really, sometimes it takes a couple tries. You got it. Oh, I think I got it. So you have to keep rotating it a little bit. The starter clutch on the back will spin. So sometimes you just have to keep rotating the flywheel to let the gear spin on the back until everything happens to line up. So you want pressure in on it while you're twisting a little bit, and eventually you'll just get everything perfect and you'll feel it slide into place. You do have to make sure you have this all the way inserted, because if you're not paying attention, you can feel like it goes in, but the flywheel is still sitting out a little bit, just a little bit too far, and your stator will never line up. Everything will never fit correctly. You'll know when it's fully inserted into the inner bearing when it's pretty tight. You don't have a bunch of slop at the back of it, and your front face of the flywheel is about flush with the edge of the case here. So from there, I can feel that everything is good. I got it meshed correctly and lined up. I expected that to take a lot longer, so I'm happy, and we'll keep this clip going. So, okay, everything's there in place. Like I mentioned when we were removing it, if you have to, sometimes you don't get it lined up perfectly and you have to pull it out and reset everything. If you do, it's no problem. Just make sure when you remove it, you might have that washer or the collar fall off and rest on the ledge back in there. It's not a problem. Just take your time, go slow, reach in and grab the part carefully so you don't drop it down into the crankcase. Again, I've changed this flywheel in testing parts on this 10-15 times, and I have never once lost them, but I know it's possible, so you just want to be careful and take your time. All right, we're going to put a new gasket in place. Always make sure your gasket surface is clean and there's no old gasket or anything left on it. So there's a locating dowel here at the top and bottom, so it's easy to hang the gasket on it. And on this, a lot of times I'll use RTV, like a black RTV sealant. I don't on this bike because it's not, the stator's not always in an oil bath. Sure, you get plenty of oil flung up from the crankshaft on the crank gear there, and everything will get a little wet, but it's not like constantly submerged or bathed in heavy oil all the time, and I don't think there's really need for a bunch of extra sealant on there, but it certainly doesn't hurt if you want to. Okay, here's my stator and my cover. I've got my grommet in place and everything's tight and Loctited. So you'll feel, you're gonna line it up and slide it straight in. You wanna do this kinda in one motion if you can, because if you get it stuck and everything's not lined up and you have to pull it back out, a lot of times you're gonna unseat the starter clutch or that washer or the collar at the back, and you're gonna have to pull the flywheel out and line everything up again. So just take your time getting it lined up. Put my stator in place, centered. I feel the magnets grab it, and I'm gonna continue pressing forward. Rotate this a little bit to line up with the dowels, and then give it a few taps. Perfect. So I can feel like grab the dowels at the top and bottom, and I knocked it in, and everything's located correctly. So that's it for installing the stator and flywheel. It's not too difficult. You're going to want to then untie this and route your stator wiring back through here, up along the frame and up to your regulator area, which we already discussed. We're not going to show plugging that back in because it's all the same process as what we did to remove it earlier. And then you're going to want to obviously put your cover bolts back in place like this. Make sure you get the ones for the clamp in place, and put those back in and tighten them up. And make sure your wires are all routed correctly, and then you can get your fairings reinstalled, and that's really all there is to it. It's really not a difficult job. You just need to take your time and be careful on the flywheel steps especially. So we're going to get that done, get the bike button back up, and then we're going to show you how to test your charging system so you know everything's working correctly. So anytime you do any work on the charging system, you should test the battery afterwards and make sure everything's working well. So I have our RMSTATOR battery tester and charging system analyzer plugged in. We're going to fire it up, and I've got a fully charged battery here, so I think we're idling around 14 volts or so, and we should see a little higher than that with some RPM. So I'm going to go ahead and fire it up. All right, perfect. So we're sitting over 14 volts, so that's excellent. So that's how you do your charging system parts on the R1. Make sure to check out our website at rmstator.com and follow us on YouTube. Leave us a comment. Let us know anything that you want us to cover if you have any questions or anything, and we're happy to go over it.